Good morning. This is Mike Billington with the LaRouche Organization video update for Tuesday, August 2nd. I'm substituting again today for Harley Schlanger. He'll be back Thursday, and tomorrow Jason Ross will be keeping up with this TLO update. So I want to start by discussing the joint statement released by the Schiller Institute, signed now by 29 signers against the release by the Ukrainian Nazi regime of a hit list, which I know has been discussed here for the last few days. This protest against this outrageous declaration declaring prominent leading citizens around the world of being spokesmen for the Kremlin, for Putin, is gathering momentum internationally. I will mention the fact that Scott Ritter, many of you know Scott Ritter, very correctly identified another aspect of the crime behind this, which is that the US government is financing the Ukrainian government, therefore also financing the Center for Countering Disinformation, as it's called, obviously set up by MI6 and the CIA, to basically attack anyone who is undermining their narrative of an unprovoked war by Russia, justifying the outrageous massive sanctions and this surrogate warfare that's taking place against Russia by NATO. What Scott Ritter had to say was that this is a breach of the US Constitution. He said that he called on his representatives, he's from New York, so this includes Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, that they must take action to ensure that funds appropriated by the United States Congress are not used to suppress the free speech rights afforded to citizens of the United States, including myself, he notes. He then says there is a chilling effect of being labeled a Russian propagandist for simply exercising the right to free speech guaranteed by the US Constitution. Moreover, Ukraine has a history of converting blacklists of this nature into kill lists, where those who speak out against the policies of the Ukraine government are being murdered or threatened with violence. I'm certain you agree with me, he says to his congressman, that Congress cannot be in a position where, through its actions, foreign governments are provided the means to intimidate citizens of the United States from exercising their constitutionally protected rights regarding free speech. Diane Sayer, I hope you're all following Diane Sayer's campaign for the US Senate seat in New York against the evil Chuck Schumer, the senator from Wall Street, the legalizer of drugs, the supporter for every war that comes along. Diane pointed out in a personal message to Schumer, is it your intent to silence my voice in an indirect but menacing fashion by voting to fund Ukrainian civil servants who have stated that I should be arrested for war crimes? Because Diane, in fact, is on the list, and the head of the center declared that those on the list are guilty of information terrorism and should be brought up on war crime charges. Now, compare that to the fake charges launched against Russia by Schumer and others for interfering in our elections by buying Facebook ads and such odorous things. Here you have a financing of a neo-Nazi operation in a foreign country directly targeting Chuck Schumer's own opponent in probably the most important electoral race in America this year. Now, the other countries are moving on this. The Danish member of parliament has called on the parliament to launch investigations. Denmark also finances the Ukraine government. And in New Zealand, one of the people on the list, a man named Matthew Robeson, who was a former minister, he was both a minister of arms control and also assistant minister of foreign affairs, prominent person in New Zealand. He issued his own statement. He started by saying he was flattered to be on such list with such eminent people. And in the time-honored tradition of scholars of open debate and not groupthink demanded by NATO, he then quotes the New Zealand Bill of Rights, which gives people the right to free speech. And he also called on the Prime Minister to immediately launch investigations. So this is a major blunder by the British Empire operation, the NATO operation. They've basically blown the cover on the fact that the Schiller Institute, where the 31st people on this list of 78 were either leading members of the Schiller Institute, including Diane Sayer, including Harley Schlanger, including especially Helga Zepp-LaRouche, but all 30 of the first names were people that spoke at Schiller Institute conferences. So this is blowing the cover on the entire operation in Ukraine, going back to 2014 when the Obama-Biden administration with Victoria Nuland and Clinton and so forth, Biden playing a leading role, led the regime change in Ukraine, overthrowing the elected government and placing a neo-Nazi cabal in power. This is exposed by their going after us because we've documented that absolutely going back to 2014. And it also blows the cover on 50 years of containment of Lyndon LaRouche. People can no longer avoid acknowledging the role of LaRouche, the Schiller Institute, in mobilizing globally to stop the collapse of Western civilization into war and into hyperinflationary breakdown. I'm going to quote from a letter written by one of our dear friends, a leading member of the LaRouche movement, Doug Maluk. He wrote a public letter to, think who he's writing this to, Tucker Carlson, Jimmy Dore, Tulsi Gabbard, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal. He forwarded them also to Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, and so forth. These are people who have been truth tellers on the whole Russiagate and especially the Ukraine war. But they, in reporting on this despicable document coming out of the Center for Containing Disinformation in Ukraine, they have not mentioned the most important thing about that document, which is that the first 30 names are people from the Schiller Institute and so forth. So Doug writes, I appreciate that you all have been outspoken, but that precisely is why it's such an outrage that every one of you has, at least up till now, ducked, copped out, flinched on the single most important implication of the recently revealed enemies list put out by the Ukraine government's disinformation agency, namely that the Kiev Banderists, these are the followers of Stepan Bandera, the Hitler cohort in Ukraine during World War II, that the Kiev Banderists see one organization as far and away the single biggest threat to puncture the fake narrative of democracy versus autocracy, so vital to the war party and its journalistic lapdogs. And like it or not, that entity is none other than the Schiller Institute of the late Lyndon LaRouche and his very much alive spouse and political successor, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Why did Tucker Carlson and Jimmy Dore each do fairly substantial reviews of this enemies list and its implications without saying a word about the LaRouche movement, whose members and collaborators comprise nearly 40% of those named? The Anglo-American establishment has spent decades of time and untold millions of dollars to blacken Lyndon LaRouche's name, to make him a political leper, radioactive, the third rail of politics, pick your metaphor, this kind of McCarthyism. He then says that there are many who know that the official line on LaRouche is garbage, but who refuse to say so publicly lest they be tarred with the same smelly brush that smeared LaRouche himself. Doing the right thing certainly involves risks. I know that quite well. As many of you know, I was imprisoned along with Lyndon LaRouche by the Bush administration. I spent 10 years in prison. I made sure that I used those years well, and I hope they regret they gave me that 10-year sabbatical leave to do the work I did on China and comparing the Confucian Renaissance in China to the the Christian Renaissance in Europe. Doug Maluk points out that it does indeed involve risks. But here's a radical suggestion, he says. Schiller LaRouche spokespersons might actually add a whole new dimension for your viewers and your listeners by offering an actual solution to the ongoing total breakdown of the transatlantic financial system that's driving the globalists to war and worse. Don't be afraid of the dreaded L word, he writes. Acknowledge LaRouche. After all, his adversaries in Kiev and their sponsors in London and Washington now certainly have done so. So I now must switch to the second front, you might say, the extreme danger of war in Asia. As I'm sure you know, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, is officially now going to Taiwan. She held back making it official until now, but now it's apparently official. This is going to repeat the provocations that were made in Russia to start the situation there, which is on the brink of global war already, where Russia was provoked, where we completely ignored Russia's efforts to get a security guarantee for themselves and all countries. And instead, we kept pushing our NATO forces up to Russia's border, forced them to move into Ukraine, and then use that to justify the massive, massive economic sanctions, as well as the surrogate war against Russia in Ukraine. Now, Pelosi's threatening to do the same thing. Now, by going into Taiwan, China has always made clear from the beginning that there is one China with two systems. Taiwan has its own government, but it's absolutely part of China. It's a sovereign province of China under the one China, two systems policy. Any attempt to separate Taiwan from China, to make independence in Taiwan, would be responded to militarily. They will finish the revolution that took place by bringing Taiwan back into China. They intend to do it peacefully, but if somebody tries to prevent that peaceful reunification over the long term, they will respond militarily. So Xi Jinping spoke with Biden last Thursday, and as you probably saw, he stated to Biden, those who play with fire will perish by fire. This is not an idle statement. We are dealing here with a threat to Chinese sovereignty, which will cause a war if we proceed. Douglas Macgregor, many of you know Colonel Macgregor. He was on Tucker Carlson last night. He basically said the same thing. He said Pelosi is insane, that the idea that we can separate Taiwan and support Taiwan independence will lead to a war that we cannot win. He made an interesting point that I didn't know, or I hadn't thought of actually. Since Taiwan was under Japanese control for a long time, until at the end of World War II. During World War II, it was the primary so-called aircraft carrier for the Japanese air war on China throughout the 1930s and 40s, killing millions of Chinese. 14 million Chinese died in World War II, a lot of them by the Japanese air wars. So he points out, if we intervene, it will be war, and we cannot win. Now, why? Partially, I think you can take note that China has built their economy from one of the poorest in the world now to one of the most advanced scientific, technological economies in the world, while we have destroyed our own economy. And the logistics for a war requires a strong economy, which the US does not have. We've deindustrialized, we've stopped building nuclear plants, we have no high-speed rail, and so on and so forth. And ironically, China has built up its economy through the methods of the American system, Alexander Hamilton. They've directed their national credit into basic infrastructure, lifting the platform of production for every citizen of their country, and now taking this to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. American system methods. Ironic, isn't it? And if you doubt that, I strongly encourage you to listen to my interview with Justin Yifu Lin. You can go to the Schiller Institute website, and under initiatives, there's a section on interviews. And if you page down the interviews, you'll find my interview with Justin Lin. He was the chief economist at the World Bank between 2008 and 2012. He realized that the World Bank wasn't interested in building infrastructure in the third world. They had an imperial view that these countries should be kept backwards to maintain access to cheap raw materials and cheap labor. He didn't agree with that. He returned to China and is now one of their leading economists, using Hamiltonian American system methods, not only to build up China as they did, but to build up the world through the Belt and Road. The old Chinese saying is to get rich, first build a road. Now, I want to close by mentioning that I did an interview yesterday with Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Chaz Freeman is, I would say, the leading Chinese expert in the United States, perhaps in the world. He was a translator for Richard Nixon in Nixon's famous 1972 visit to China that began relations. He was then an ambassador in Saudi Arabia and a deputy in China. So he called Pelosi's visit, quote, an act of extreme irresponsibility on the speaker's part. I think, he said, the issue of Ukraine and the issue of Taiwan do have something in common in that the primary lesson we should take from what has happened in Ukraine is that if you defy the forcefully expressed objectives of a great power to your actions, you do so at your own peril and the peril of those whom you purport to protect. I asked Chaz if he thought the response internationally was adequate to prevent this disaster and to restore some sanity to the world. I'm going to read his answer. I'm sorry to say that I believe the general reaction internationally, and certainly in my own country, the United States, is one of despondency and a sense of impotence and frustration as the equivalent of a tragedy in the true Greek sense unfolds. Everyone can see where this is likely to go. The protagonists, nonetheless, proceed on course, and the course is unheeded. So this is a moment in which, indeed, people should be giving voice to their objections to a course of action, which unnecessarily risks a war, possibly a nuclear war. And among other things, as you pointed out earlier, he said to me, the certain destruction of both Taiwan democracy and its prosperity. I wish I could say that I see effective popular response to the dangers we face, but I don't. So this is our job. This is why the LaRouche Organization was built over these last 50-some years, was to prepare for this moment when people are forced to recognize that everything's going to hell, that we're entering a dark age. And they look back to see who's been telling the truth all these years and who's been lying. And it's the LaRouche Organization, the Schiller Institute, and our magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, which are the standard bearer for a fight not only to stop the descent into a new dark age, a new war, a nuclear war, but also to build a renaissance, a real renaissance for mankind, for all nations, not for one section or another section, but for mankind, as we go into the era of space colonization, as we stop being earthlings and become citizens of the universe. This is the moment where you need to work with us and to recruit your friends and neighbors and associates and your political representatives to join with us in this fight for a new paradigm for mankind. Thank you. Tomorrow, Jason Ross will be here. I encourage you to tune in. Thank you.